The sound of a rifle butt striking the floor echoed like a gunshot in the suffocating air of the courtroom, cutting through the breathless silence. Every eye turned toward the man sitting in the old wheelchair, its wheels creaking as if groaning under the weight of the past. Sergeant James Jim Sullivan, a war veteran with a face etched with scars, held his head high in a faded military uniform. The medals on his chest gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but his eyes, deep gray and unfathomable, held an unspoken pain. Beside him, a German shepherd named Titan stood tall, ears erect like blades, sharp brown eyes scanning the room as if guarding an invisible battlefield. The crowd held its breath, no one daring to move, as if even the faintest cough could shatter the tension strung tight as a wire. Jim's calloused fingers clenched the leash, trembling not from fear, but from the fury burning in his chest. Titan was more than just a military dog, he was blood and soul, the comrade who had dragged Jim from the inferno of war and the nightmares that followed. The judge's voice rang out, dry and cold, cutting through Jim's thoughts. "Sergeant Sullivan, this may be your final chance to speak. The military has decided. Titan is government property and will be reassigned to a new mission." The words stabbed into Jim like a knife, making him tighten his grip on the leash until his knuckles turned white. The crowd murmured, a few discreetly wiping away tears, but Jim didn't care. His gaze was locked onto the judge's emotionless eyes, as if daring the entire world to challenge him. "Your Honor," Jim's voice, rough and strained with pent-up emotion, broke the silence. "Titan is not an object you can take and discard at will. He ran into the jaws of death with me in Iraq, pulled me out of the rubble when an IED exploded just meters away. He stayed by my side through nights of terror, when I woke drenched in sweat, the echoes of bombs still ringing in my head. You want to rip him away from me? Then step over my dead body first." His words struck the courtroom like a gunshot, making a few in the crowd flinch. An elderly woman in the back sobbed aloud. Titan lifted his head slightly, as if understanding every word, his eyes radiating unwavering loyalty. The lights flickered for a brief moment, as if foreshadowing something imminent, but no one noticed. Everyone was caught in Jim's story. Memories surged back, the wail of sirens, the acrid stench of gunpowder, and the suffocating certainty that he would die beneath the rubble until Titan appeared, barking and digging frantically to save him. And now, the military wanted to separate them, as if those sacrifices meant nothing. The crowd began murmuring again, some whispering, "This is wrong," while others looked at Titan with a mix of sympathy and respect. The judge slammed his gavel, attempting to restore order, but his hand trembled, and his eyes wavered between logic and emotion. Jim took a deep breath, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Titan is the reason I'm alive, the reason I'm sitting here today. If you take him away, you're not just taking a dog, you're taking my soul." His words rippled through the courtroom like a stone cast into still water. A few people clapped hesitantly, but the applause quickly faded into heavy silence as the judge bowed his head, gripping his gavel like it was the only thing keeping him from being swept away by emotion. The crowd waited, their hearts beating in unison with Jim's, but none of them knew that this moment was only the beginning of a much greater storm, one that Titan, with his keen instincts, had already sensed coming. The atmosphere in the courtroom suddenly turned into a pressure cooker, ready to explode. The judge's gavel had barely struck the sound block when another noise rang out, sharp, fierce, like a gunshot on the battlefield. Titan, the sleek black German shepherd, sprang up from his seated position, ears pricked like arrows, his sharp eyes locked onto the judge. He barked, not an ordinary bark, but a deep, guttural snarl so powerful it made the old wooden floor tremble. The metal leash rattled in Jim's hands as Titan yanked hard, forcing him to grit his teeth to keep his grip. The crowd shuddered, some screamed in fear, while others murmured in panic, "What's happening?" A chill shot down Jim's spine. He knew that sound, that look in Titan's eyes. He had seen it 100 times on the battlefields of Iraq, when the dog detected a buried mine or an enemy lurking in the shadows. "Titan, stand down!" Jim shouted, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Titan didn't listen. He lunged forward, claws scraping against the wooden floor, the leash stretched so tight it was on the verge of snapping. His gaze was locked on the massive oak double doors at the far end of the courtroom, where only a sliver of light from the hallway seeped through a dim, ghostly glow. "He's warning us about something," Jim whispered, his heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. The judge, his face drained of color, slammed his gavel repeatedly, but the sound was nothing more than a feeble buzz amidst the growing storm. "Control your dog immediately, Sullivan," he barked, his voice shaking with barely concealed fear. But Jim wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on Titan, and in his mind, memories of war played like a fast-forwarded reel, the deafening roar of explosions, the screams of fallen comrades, and Titan's frantic barking before dragging him out of a burning armored vehicle. "Your Honor," Jim's voice cut through the noise like a blade, "Titan isn't going crazy. He's trained to detect danger, bombs, hostiles, anything. If he's acting like this, something is wrong." His words were like gasoline thrown onto an open flame. The crowd erupted into full-blown panic. A middle-aged man in the back row jumped to his feet, knocking over his chair with a loud crash, while a woman clutched her child tightly, whispering prayers under her breath. Two security guards, Mike and Tony, stepped forward from either side of the judge's bench, their hands resting on their holsters, their eyes darting between Jim and the door Titan was fixated on. "It's just a dog," Tony muttered, but his voice wavered, betraying his own uncertainty. Mike, the taller of the two, exchanged a look with the judge before stepping toward the door, each of his footsteps landing like the ticking of a countdown. Then Titan suddenly went silent. The abrupt stillness was even more terrifying than his growls. He stood motionless, every muscle coiled like a statue ready to spring, his eyes glowing with intensity. And then, from the hallway, a sound, clink, sharp, metallic, like a blade dropping onto the cold stone floor. The courtroom collectively held its breath. Someone in the crowd screamed, and Jim felt a cold sweat run down his spine. "Titan sensed it," he murmured, gripping the leash so tightly his knuckles ached. Mike froze in front of the door, his fingers trembling as they wrapped around the handle. Tony pulled out his flashlight, its white-blue beam slicing through the darkness beyond the threshold. The hallway was empty, yet the air felt thick, suffocating, as though someone, or something, was lurking just out of sight. Then it appeared, a shadow, swift as a phantom, flickering past the edge of the flashlight's glow. Tony stumbled back, nearly dropping the light, his voice breaking into a frantic shout, "Something's out there!" Titan let out a ferocious snarl and surged forward with such force that Jim almost got yanked from his wheelchair. Before anyone could react, the doors burst open completely, and from the darkness emerged a figure, tall, hood pulled over his face, hands buried deep in his pockets. He stood motionless, but his very presence sent a freezing chill through the room. Behind him, two more figures lurked in the dim light, and something glinted in their hands, metal, sharp, and deadly. Jim's eyes locked onto the stranger, his blood boiling. Titan growled low, ready to strike at a moment's notice. "What the hell do you want?" Jim snarled, though deep down, he already knew this threat wasn't just a passing danger. It was the beginning of a nightmare. The courtroom now felt like a battlefield frozen in time. Imaginary smoke and dust from Jim's war-torn memories blended with the suffocating air, making every breath a struggle. The man in the hoodie stood tall in the doorway, the darkness from the hallway clinging to him like a living cloak. His eyes, cold, razor-sharp like daggers, scanned the room before settling on Titan. The German shepherd snarled relentlessly, his fur bristling like quills, claws scraping the wooden floor with sharp, deliberate strokes. Jim tightened his grip on the leash, his hands shaking from the adrenaline, but his gaze never wavered from the stranger. He knew that look. the look of a predator who had chosen its prey. The two figures behind the hooded man stepped forward, catching the flickering beam of Tony's flashlight. The light glinted off the sharp blades in their hands. The crowd screamed, chairs toppled over with deafening crashes as people scrambled toward the emergency exits, shoving each other in blind panic. "Everyone, stay calm," the judge shouted, pounding his gavel wildly, but his voice was weak, like a whisper in the middle of a storm. Mike, the tall security officer, raised his gun, his hands trembling slightly but his voice firm. "Stay where you are. Drop the weapons." Tony stood behind him, flashlight quivering as he tried to shine it into the hooded man's face, but the darkness beneath the hood seemed to devour the light. The stranger tilted his head, a smirk forming beneath the shadows, not the grin of a man afraid, but one disturbingly confident. He took a step forward, his heavy military boots thudding against the floor, each step hammering against Jim's chest like a countdown to something inevitable. "I don't want bloodshed," he said, his voice low and cold, slicing through the chaos like a blade. "I just want the dog. Hand him over, and everyone walks away." The words hit Jim like a bullet, making him grit his teeth so hard his jaw ached. Titan snarled louder, lunging forward with such force that the leash cut into Jim's hand, leaving behind a streak of raw, reddened skin. "You want Titan?" Jim's voice was a low growl, his eyes burning like fire on the battlefield. He pushed his wheelchair forward slightly, ignoring the sharp pain in his legs that had long since lost their feeling. "You'll have to step over my dead body first. He's not an experiment. He's not a possession. He's my brother. He pulled me from the jaws of death, and I swear to God, if you lay a finger on him, you'll regret stepping into this room." His voice rang out like thunder, drowning out the panicked screams. A few people stopped running, turning back to stare at Jim, some in shock, others in admiration. Titan stood his ground beside him, just like he had on the battlefield, ready to fight. The hooded man's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing as if calculating his next move. He raised a hand, signaling his two accomplices to hold back. They hesitated before stepping back, but the glint of their blades remained visible in the dim light, a silent promise that this wasn't over. "You've got guts, Sullivan," the stranger murmured, his voice cold and cutting. "But you don't understand. That dog isn't just special to you. He's the key to something much bigger. Keep him, and you'll see the consequences. This isn't over." With that, he turned, unhurried, as if the world itself had to wait for him. He gave a slight wave, and his men withdrew into the darkness. Their silhouettes dissolved into the shadows of the hallway, leaving behind a suffocating silence. The crowd exhaled collectively, realizing the immediate danger had passed. The judge, his face ghostly pale, set down his gavel with trembling hands. "Court adjourned," he announced hoarsely before collapsing into his chair, clutching his chest. The spectators slowly returned to their seats, whispering in hushed confusion, but Jim didn't move. He remained where he was, eyes locked on the now closed doors, his fingers gently running over Titan's fur. "You did good, buddy," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. But deep inside, a storm raged. Whoever that man was, he knew Jim's name. He knew about Titan. And his warning wasn't just an empty threat. Titan rested his head against Jim's lap, his warm breath a silent vow that they would always stand together. As the courtroom gradually emptied, Jim stared into the distance, the chill of the stranger's words still clinging to him like a shadow. And he was right about one thing: this wasn't over. But if they came back, Jim and Titan would be ready. No one, no army, no enemy, and certainly not that hooded bastard, would ever tear them apart. They were a team. Forever.